Hi, Britt. Just 1 second. Okay, now we can start. I will call this meeting to order at 1:02 p.m. and start with the land acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, the people of the Three Fires known as Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi Nation, who have inhabited this land from time immemorial. And further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. We also recognize the Métis and Inuit whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse people. Moving on to approval of the agenda, are there any additions to the agenda? Okay, the only thing I'll add is a question or a concern I received from residents. With Elm Street now complete, people are saying there's speeding going out Elm Street. So if we can just get that on the radar. That wasn't intended as a pun. I'll ask for a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as amended. Peter and Barry, all in favor. That is carried. Thank you. If there's any declaration of pecuniary interest, that may be declared at any time throughout the meeting. Minutes of the previous meetings from November 14th, 2023. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Barry, Peter, and is there any discussion about those minutes? Seeing none, I will call the vote then. All in favor? Carried. We have no delegations, no correspondence, so we are on to reports and recommendations. 8.1 COR 2024-003 Joint Grey Bruce Police Services Detachment Board Update, Community Safety and Policing Act 2019. The recommendation is that the Township of Georgian Bluffs Police Services Board receive report COR 2024-003 for information. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Peter and then Barry, and is there any discussion? Brittany, do you want to present on this first, and then we will ask questions after that? Okay, go ahead.
Please and thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize, I'm not there in person with you guys. I'm afraid the snow has not spared us over in Simcoe County. Our little Collingwood snow bubble is sincerely delivering today, so I apologize I'm not there in person. Carly and Rayburn are just going to pull up a presentation that I've prepared to help us move through the report that you have in front of you today. Okay, thank you, Carly and Rayburn. So to start us off, a lot of this will look familiar. A lot of this will have some unanswered questions. I'll say that up front. There are still a lot of unknowns. And if I may, to that effect, Madam Chair, through you, if we could please hold questions to the end of the presentation, simply because my being virtual, it's difficult for me to see when hands are flying, and I would hate to have you wrangle hands and get my attention at the same time. So if we could please just hold questions to the end of the presentation, then I'd be happy to field whatever questions may come up. And with that, Carly,
that sounds fine.
Perfect, thank you. And with that, Carly, if I could please have you move to the next slide. So just to start us off, we're going to move through a bit of a background piece because we've been considering this for so long, this being the discussion of the changes to the structure of the existing Police Services Board, not only for us, but through the entire province of Ontario. We began considering this and having these discussions in 2019 with introduction of Bill 68, otherwise known as the Comprehensive Ontario Police Services Act, which established the Community Safety and Policing Act, which, once proclaimed, will repeal the Police Services Act as we know it today. From 2019, we then moved to 2020, in which both members Hugh and member Hatt will recall attending various feedback sessions and roundtable sessions hosted by the Ministry of the Solicitor General to gather feedback about the proposed amendments to the police services structure. That occurred throughout that year and honestly has occurred throughout this entire length of time, but mainly was focused on in 2020 prior to the push in 2021 that led to our creation of the joint board. Then that brings us to 2021, which, as I mentioned, is when we established the Grey Bruce Joint Detachment Board, in which there was a push from the province to have all detachment communities come together to form one joint board, which is exactly what we did. The Grey Bruce Detachment Area has created the Grey Bruce Joint Detachment Board to govern the entire detachment area. We came together, we created a proposal, and we submitted it to the province in June of 2021. It then was slightly amended in 2022 prior to it receiving approval at the ministry level. When I say it was slightly amended, I mean the First Nations community, commonly known as Cape Croker, expressed interest in participating on the joint board to the ministry level. They then amended the proposal to include them and then approved it, which brings us to 2023, or today. In December of 2023, we received notification from the province that the bill, or the Community Safety and Policing Act, would receive royal assent in 2024, most specifically April 1st, 2024, and further that all of the detachment municipalities, communities, and thereby the joint board would have to be ready to be in compliance by that date. And Carly, if I can get you to move to the next slide, please. So just to review, before we get into the 4 steps you see laid out in front of you in the report today, the Grey Bruce Joint Detachment Board will be and is required to be composed of at least 5 members. That's directly out of the legislation, being the Community Safety and Policing Act. Out of those 5 members that must be at least appointed to the board, 20% must be community appointees, with the remaining 20% provincial appointees. The Act is clear in what the board is established to do, and further, what policies the board is expected to draft and establish. But most specifically, the Joint Detachment Board is established to provide adequate and effective policing in the area for which it has policing responsibility. And Carly, next slide, please. Which brings us to the overall composition of the board. So while the legislation dictates there must be 5 members on this board, our board will be much larger than that, given the large geographical area that the Grey Bruce Detachment covers. As you can see in front of you, there are 16 members of this board, 1 appointed elected official from each of the representing municipalities and First Nations communities, as well as 3 provincial appointees and 4 community appointees. Now you'll note, as by the asterisk placed beside the 19%, we are not at the 20% mandated minimum for the provincial appointees. This was a decision made by the province, not through our submission. As the Cape Croker addition was made post-submission or post-approval to the submission, the province has given us the ability to move forward with 3 provincial appointees in recognizing we're not quite at that 20% minimum. So this board, once composed and once formalized, will be a large board made up of 16 members. Carly, next slide, please. Which brings us back to where we are today. So in December of 2023, the collective clerks received notification from the ministry that the Community Safety and Policing Act will be proclaimed as of April 1st, 2024, and therefore The board and all of the detachment communities therein are expected to be within compliance of the regulations contained therein, including establishment of the joint board structure that was approved at the ministry level. Now, upon receipt of this correspondence, all collective clerks, including representation from all of the municipalities, First Nations communities, and the OPP, met to discuss the nuances of what this would mean. You know, it's one thing to say the board must be ready to go by April 1st, and it's another thing to actually ensure that it's ready to be in compliance by that date, which out of that discussion led to the 4 steps you see in front of you today. So Carly, next slide, please. The 4 steps are indicated here in a visual representation, but we're going to take some time to go through each of the steps now. And again, if there's any questions, please hold them to the end of the presentation. Carly, next slide, please. So to begin, step 1, appoint council representatives and establish ad hoc committee. Now, step 1 is where we are today. We're here to discuss appointing council representatives and establishing the ad hoc selection committee. So the first step to really get us up and running to make sure we're ready to go for April 1st is each respective council needs to appoint one elected official to the joint board and thereby to the ad hoc selection committee. The same member appointed to the joint board will be the same member that represents that municipality on the ad hoc selection committee. Now, you may be asking yourself, Brittany, what is an ad hoc selection committee? Attached to your report as Appendix C, you will find a terms of reference that establishes what we are referring to as the Grey Bruce Joint Board Community Appointee Ad Hoc Selection Committee. Now, try saying that 5 times fast. I know that that's a mouthful. This committee, this ad hoc committee, will be formed for one purpose and one purpose only: to review the community applications for appointment to the board. And Carly, next slide, please. Now, while we're moving through step 1 and step 2 in a linear fashion, they're actually happening in unison. So, Niall, I see you shifting over. Did you want to add something? No? Okay. Okay. So while they appear to be happening in a linear fashion, they are happening in unison behind the scenes. So as mentioned, the community members, there are 4 of them. They will be appointed on a rotating basis at large throughout the entire detachment community. That's a callback to the proposal that was submitted to the province in 2021. So while there are 4 community appointees, we do not yet know which municipalities they will represent because they will be appointed at an at-large basis. Now, the rotating basis, as you'll recall, will be given, the rotating basis will give people that, or municipalities that haven't had representation on the board in the first term, they'll give them priority treatment in the second term. The terms will match up with that of the council term and that of their appointed elected official peers on the joint board. So the advertisement for the community members has been developed and will be circulated within the next week. So step 2 and step 1 are happening together to make sure we're reaching that April 1st deadline. Carly, next slide, please. Thank you. And that brings us to step 3. So these are the fine nuances that I was referring to earlier, being creating the board and creating the establishing the procedures that the board will need to effectively move into being an effective board. So an implementation team has been created of myself, Southgate, Chatsworth, and the town of South Bruce Peninsula, as well as representation from the OPP, to create administrative policies as well as a procedure bylaw to ensure that once that April 1st deadline comes around, we have the ability to run a meeting. And Carly, next slide. And step 4, last but not least, is our training. And this is the piece that is the largest question mark at this time. As all of you will recall, throughout all of those feedback sessions, the roundtable sessions, training has remained a large pillar of this process since conception of the legislation. The training is written directly into the legislation, meaning there is a requirement for all representatives on the board to be trained. The extent of, cost of, and specifics of that training have not yet been defined. It is the intention of the implementation team and of the collective board to ensure that those that are appointed to the board prior to April 1st receive training, so long as that training is available through the province prior to that date. And Carly, next slide, please. Next, we have financials, which again remain relatively unknown at this time because the cost of training and the overall impact of the board remain unknown. Each participating municipality has budgeted $5,000 both in year 1 and year 2 to assist in implementation costs of the board. And again, what that looks like, we're not sure yet, but we do know that we will have to at least make up for per diem rates, mileage, etc., and administrative costs of creating the board and hosting their initial meetings. And Carly, next slide, please. So in considering our next steps, with the April 1st proclamation date, it is anticipated that this current board will be dissolved as of their March 5th meeting, meaning that will be the last meeting of this Police Services Board. Now, I will say that within the legislation, there is a bit of a backup built in, noting that the current structure will remain in effect should the April 1st deadline not be met, or should the province not be ready to implement the changes as of April 1st. But with that in mind, the collective Grey Bruce clerks and, by extension, the OPP are putting all of our resources to ensure that we are ready to comply with the legislation as of April 1st. However, with that being said, we will continue to update this board as well as our respective councils to ensure that you are in the know just as much as we are as in considering the changes as they stand today. And with that, Madam Chair, I would welcome any questions from the board.
Thank you, Brittany. And I will turn to board members for questions. Peter, go ahead.
I just have one, Brittany, and you maybe answered it. When you do my assumption was there was going to be an administrator that was going to be put in place. I'm assuming that group you just mentioned, including yourself and the other townships, will be the administration group until further notice to get this thing established and up and running?
That's correct, yes. So the implementation team that I made reference to being myself, Southgate, South Bruce, Chatsworth, and a member of the OPP have already met on a number of bases to ensure that we're kind of meeting our benchmarks to ensure that we are in compliance. But yes, to answer your questions, we are taking the lead on this.
And I'll just comment on that. That's good to know because that's probably the absolute start point of the whole restructuring.
For sure.
Yeah.
So if I may, at that point, I think it's fair to say that a 16-member board is no light task to pull together, particularly given the amount of work that needs to go on in the background around setting up the governance structures for that board, setting up the policies and procedures that the board wishes to govern itself by, and dealing with some of the things that the Act says are the responsibility of the board to do. So there are things that new board has to do that we, for example, don't currently have to do, that the new board will have to do. And there's a body of work that will be taken in both the organisation, administration, and the running of that board on an ongoing basis. When Britt and I were discussing this last week, it's similar, and I apologise for this comparison. It's in essence setting up an entirely new municipality, municipal structure. You're going to have a council essentially of 16 people. All the processes and procedures that a council would have, that this board has, need to be created for the new board. Now, when they sat on council areas, we were largely able to simply adopt the policies and procedures of the council area within it, which it sits. So our police services board, for the all intents and purposes, adopts the policies and procedures that we apply for council of Georgian Bluff. So the same meeting protocols, same meeting procedures, the allowances, the per diems, the way in which we conduct meetings are all reflective of how the township of Georgian Bluff does business. We now have 7 new municipal areas and 2 First Nation areas that will be part of this board, all of whom will have their own processes in place. And this new administration has to find a way of blending, combining, taking the best of, or creating from scratch all of those processes and policies for this new board. So I think the question is extremely well put. Is the administration of this board is not a light task. It's not the sort of task that will be well served by somebody doing it off the side of their desk. And so I think one of the early conversations of the new board is going to be turning their minds to how that board is successfully set up to administer itself in a way which is going to establish that board's ability to be successful. I suspect that resource does not currently exist. I don't think, and in the conversation Britt and I have had, I don't think that this is that 9 municipal clerks or municipal clerks, 7 municipal clerks and two appointees from First Nations communities are going to be able to sort of divvy those tasks up and say, well, we'll go off and do these little things, because I think what will end up is you'll end up with too many cooks and broth and all that sort of fun stuff coming about. Equally, I don't think it's going to be a case that we're able to say, well, North Bruce, you're going to have capacity for this, so your clerk can spend half of their time off doing this piece. So I think that the new board will have to figure out how to administer itself in a sustainable way on a go-forward basis. And I think that will be a body of work. So as Britt has outlined in her presentation, I think, that 5,000 gets us there for the starter. And there is a lot of experience which will be brought by extension into the room when the board first meets. But the administration of this board is a body of work which is a body into itself, which I think we haven't fully wrestled with or grappled with. And I'm looking to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn, but the question is well placed, and I don't want the brevity of the answer to make it seem like that's necessarily an easy task, because the administration is not.
So I would throw out, when the province has created this new idea of a detachment board, which I think is a good idea, did they consider that the detachment itself would be providing someone to be that administrator?
No, not at all. And through your worship, no. But and I'll elaborate on that in the sense that the board itself is an extension of the municipalities, and we have an obligation to report to that board. And within that reporting structure, I think there is built in some objectivity, and that's the point of it, to not have us being the lead and doing what we do by nature and just taking over and getting it done. I think it's important that the administrative portion and the board portion be administered outside of the OPP to give it objectivity. So although I said no, I wanted to give you a little more background.
Yeah, and that is what I suspected. It seems strange to me that they've set this whole thing up and not had the whole thing thought out as to how do you bring 9 different municipalities together, and who's going to look after administration and who's going to pay for that then, because the idea of $5,000 per year per municipality isn't enough to do that. That, or they're trying to let on that provincial staff are very poorly paid.
Oh, you got your hand up before I turn the mic on. You go.
Go ahead, Brittany.
And just a comment in respect to that the weight of this administrative mountain that we're climbing has not been lost on any of us collectively throughout the detachment board. We're starting to put our heads together as to creative ways in which we can administer this board without burdening one municipality over the other, looking at a way to potentially share the administration costs as well as share potentially resources amongst the detachment area. What that looks like yet, I can't say, but we are turning our minds to more creative solutions than just dropping it in the lap of one municipality and running in the opposite direction.
Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, question, Brittany. You put all these municipalities together and you come up with the budget and it goes back to council for the approval or not. If it does, one of these municipalities that are not in it now, like Erin, LLC or North Creek Peninsula or whatever, they get to come along and say, hey, we don't agree with this. Then what happens? Is it stalemate this again or not? And like, I understood that the board that's here now can sit in past April the 1st after the act is passed. But we don't really have much power of anything, which we don't have right now anyway. So, but we could still continue on till this is all done. Am I right or wrong?
So in regards to the first, any council can decide to cut budgets where they see fit. I will say that all of the existing police services boards have an existing budget that has been carried over throughout multiple budget cycles. So for example, the Township of Georgian Bluffs, while we've budgeted in addition to the existing budget, the existing budget for the Police Services Board is already there to cover costs associated with conferences, per diems, mileage, etc. So once we move beyond the implementation costs, the costs should be theorized to go down because the municipality won't have its own board. It will be essentially a smaller version in which we have less bodies on one board. While it's bringing the detachment together and creating better conversations, there will not be 3 people for Georgian Bluffs to cover the costs associated for on this board. At maximum, there will be 2 should the community appointee come from Georgian Bluffs. So it is anticipated that costs associated from a municipal perspective should decrease over the length of this board. So it's really just the implementation costs that we're looking at beefing up that budget for.
I might weigh in briefly through you, Madam Chair, that the theory of this, the theory behind it is we're better together than we are individually, and I think that the cost will decrease. But in my experience,
Never happened.
yeah, because whereas we might meet 4 times a year, the board might end up meeting 12 times a year. They might choose to meet monthly, and so the frequency may go up whilst the individual representation goes down, or the length of the meeting might go up. So we might meet for 4 one-hour meetings a year. If they met for 4 3-hour meetings a year, all of a sudden that saving of having 1 less on this board. But I think the value for money and the efficiency will go up regardless. We might not see savings. I've never yet been on a council where we come back 1 year and say, oh, by the way, we've managed to find some savings this year, and we're going to decrease the budget. I'm not sure I've ever seen that. I'm not sure I will ever see it. And I apologise to the board chair as mayor in that regards. So I'm not sure we'll see costs go down, but we should see efficiency and value for money go up through this process. And I had another point, but it's gone completely. But I think as Brittany has alluded to, a large chunk of those costs are already budgeted for. So it's not that we're having to find money that's not already budgeted. I don't think that would be the case for any one of 7 of 9 at least. That there's new money that needs to be found. It's just moving where one pot of money goes into another area. The implementation side of things is a little bit different. That will be something that the board has to wrestle with. But once you get through that implementation period, in theory, the cost should be no higher than they are today.
So I would throw out there that is the idea that each municipality is going to put funds into kind of a pot for everything to be paid from. So the municipality is now putting 5,000 in for that anyone sitting on that board is being paid out of that 5,000 per municipality rather than being paid individually in their own municipalities. Because the next problem I see there is whose remuneration plan are we following? Because some municipalities pay better for meetings than others. Some include that in a base salary that you get and that's it. Everything's included. So how has that been structured or has it been structured? Go ahead, Britt.
Thank you. So those are that's one of the nuances that the implementation team has to sort out prior to the April 1st deadline. It has been discussed and theorized that whichever municipality or body becomes the administration for this board would essentially hold that pot and invoice out to the municipalities for costs related to the board. But what the per diem and mileage structure looks like remains unknown because the administrative body remains unknown. So all I can say is to be determined on what the mileage and the per diems will look like.
I would.
Gary, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and again, just a final point on that one. I think to the board members' initial question around the concern that if a municipality was not to, say they didn't want to put their 5,000 into this board, the board is a legislative function. So the municipalities have to participate in the board, and so the board will determine its costs. And we had this little conversation a few weeks ago around the potential for contracts and so on and so forth. But I would believe that if the board determines a budget is required to run the board, because the board is a legislative requirement of the member municipalities that participate in it, there will be no choice in that municipality's funding of the running of the board. And so I don't believe that there would be a choice in that need to fund. The other thing to bear in mind is quite a lot of the costs that are currently expensed on running this board and indeed would be seen by running the new board are in-kind costs. So, for example, there is a cost associated to running this room. There's a cost of my time here, of the clerk's time, and so on and so forth. So there are some costs which it is expected would continue to be absorbed by the member municipalities as in-kind costs. And one of those could well be things like meeting venues and so on and so forth. And so the board will be leaning on its member agencies to provide some of those in-kind supports on an ongoing basis, as well as an actual financial cost. And I remembered the point I was making. I apologize.
Barry, go ahead. You had a comment?
Yeah. It's just like, that would be like section 31 then, like the other police, like if they're, you're mentioning like in the budget end of it, whatever this committee wants, but in that budget, municipality has no choice. That's one thing I was gonna. And another question I had was if a municipality, could be Georgia Bluffs, it could be Meaford or whatever, got into this situation to say, hey, our cost is going to be up. Can they still opt to get costing from, say, the city of Owen Sound or whatever municipality? And what does that do to the rest of this board?
So you're asking if we were to decide we didn't want to be part of the detachment board, but that we were going to have the city of Owen Sound come out here and do our policing, how does that affect the rest of it? Okay.
If I may jump in, Madam Chair, From a legislative perspective, it would mean simply amending the regulations to release that one municipality from the joint board. From a contractual basis, I mean, not to speculate, but the OPP detachment contracts, being Section 10 and 5.1 board contracts, are being dissolved in effect with this new structure. So we will all have to sign a new contract upon commencement of this new structure. So while we could apply to amend the regulations to be released, we would also have a contractual obligation with the OPP.
Did that answer all the question you had on that one?
I think so, yeah, that's the, even more coming up like.
Yeah.
So I would have a question about location of the meetings. Is it planned that that will move around or would be with the municipality that's going to take on the administration? And will virtual attendance be allowed? And I guess I'm thinking if Grey Highlands decides they'll take on the administration, somebody coming from Northern Bruce Peninsula could have a 2-hour drive to get there. You know, that type of thing is going to have to be considered as well. So is that being built into it that it would be virtual? Go ahead, Britt.
Thank you. And you know, you and I are thinking on the same wavelength there, because I said almost exactly the same thing in our implementation meeting. Considering how large of a geographical area we cover, we really have no other choice but to offer a virtual component, especially considering of, you know, what I'm looking out my window and I'm seeing complete whiteouts. We really don't have another option, right? So, but with that comes a challenge, because some of our counterparts that are involved in the detachment board do not have the ability to offer virtual attendance, or hybrid participation, I should call it. So if we're considering administration of the board, that then creates a smaller pot of municipalities that are equipped to take on responsibility for this board, especially in considering the hybrid option. So while it's being discussed, and while I think it's something that needs to be prioritized, and I will see that it's prioritized, what it looks like yet, I don't know.
So are we, as Georgian Bluffs, continuing to take the lead on the administrative side for now? Okay, and
Yes.
that's fine. I'm quite comfortable with that. I think that's important, as I'm going to try and get off the new board.
Yeah. So through you, Madam Mayor, I will firmly put my acting CAO hat on at this point in time and say, and Britt and I have had these conversations as well. I think that we are by default leading. I think it was a case of, if you didn't step back quick enough, you were by default the volunteer, and we were perhaps not hasty enough in our retreat. So we're taking the reins on, and Britt's definitely taking that one on. I think that's something that as a municipality we will keep a close eye on, recognizing that the body of work that this may inspire. And so, yes, I mean, I think I take my hats off to Britt right now, but we will monitor it to make sure that we don't lose Britt to simply becoming the administrator for the detachment board by default.
So I would also then add to that, because this is all coming back to Georgian Bluffs Council tomorrow night. I think it's important that we are very clear with council that that's the role we're in at this point, and that if council as a whole gives direction to stay with that, I guess we want to be very clear that throughout that detachment board, we're going to need to be reimbursed for that extra time, or we are going to need somehow to find additional staffing time to be able to take that body of work on. So I think it's important we're very clear with council tomorrow night exactly what this is going to entail.
So I think, and again, I'll put the acting hat back on there firmly, but I think that you're quite right, that we need to very closely monitor this. And again, and Britt's already doing this with the other members on the detachment board to make sure that the appropriate resources are put in place, and that it is not unfairly left to any one of the 9 organizations around the table, or 10 organizations around the table, including our OPP colleagues, to unfairly burden the weight of this. And so I think that's, or not necessarily unfairly, but to burden the weight with it being a decrease in a service provision somewhere else, i.e. us having to reallocate resources that were allocated somewhere else to doing this. I think it's certainly a conversation we've already had. So I know it's a conversation that's already been had around the municipal clerks.
Brittany, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, Niall is quite correct. This is a conversation that has been had time and time again throughout the meetings of the implementation team. And it is not my intention to not have another update to each respective council as to what administration is going to look like and what further costs may come out of that administration organization, whatever that may look like. So while I agree, Madam Mayor, that we do need to be making it abundantly clear as to what admin looks like, I do intend to have a much more fulsome update in the future prior to implementation of the board in April.
Good, thank you. Barry, go ahead.
Question, when you have these meetings, is there any way that that all can be sent to the police board of what you're doing, an update?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also you got a 16 board members. Where's the facility in this area where you can hold meetings with that large of people?
And if I may jump in, that's another thing that has been discussed throughout the implementation team. None of us have council chambers large enough to accommodate 16 people. So it would automatically involve using, community centers or other facilities that would be able to house this many people.
The other option being the County of Grey Council chambers, because that's certainly large enough and has all the technological needs that would allow it to be virtual and all of that. So perhaps that's a consideration, is looking at that, and it's fairly central, or as central as you're going to get to the whole region.
That's a good idea. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Peter, go ahead.
To you very briefly. So the other one to look at, again, just bearing in mind who we've got, and I know it's perhaps not so local, because I've got Bruce County. Obviously, 2 member municipalities are going to be Bruce County, so maybe the Bruce County building. Well, I think it's in Walkerton, isn't it?
Yeah, county seats in Walkerton for
Maybe-
Bruce County. I
maybe
don't
we
think
can-
everybody wants to go there.
Let's ignore me.
Just a comment. Excuse me. Brittany, we're glad you're spearheading this up, because these budgets they don't just happen, they evolve, and you've got your hand on the pulse of that. I can tell that you are, things are going to come along, and you're going to keep track, like you're going to watch it evolve. And a year from now, when it's fully operating, it can all be supported in a uncontested way, I'm sure. I mean, that's the whole goal of it. So thanks for your hard work.
I have a question that has to do with the training, and I know we don't have all the answers there, but and I think one of the things I'm glad that I think I've finally read or heard is that the membership on this board is going to go with council terms, which when we asked that question at the conference last year, that wasn't clear as to what the term would be. So running it along with council terms makes the most sense. But who's going to take the training? Is it only going to be the board appointees, or any interested person can take the training who maybe wants to be on that police services board or the new detachment board? And I guess what I'm thinking of is, if you had 2 people on council interested in the training, can they both take it in the event that one doesn't pass the training, which I don't think will happen, but it is an eventuality, or in the event that someone finds they can't keep up to that amount of work and wants to step back, somebody else on a council is all ready to step in. Go ahead, Brittany.
Thank you. So the regulations are clear in that only those appointed to the board are eligible to take the training. So that would mean provincial appointees, community appointees, and elected officials. Now, I don't know that this is a possibility, but I will connect to the province now that we've kind of spurred this conversation. Similar to the way in which the Grey County policy speaks to alternate appointments, I don't see why the board couldn't enact a similar policy appointing alternates basically just to the board. But with that being said, that's strictly a hypothesis of mine. I'm not sure that that can actually happen, but I'll connect with the province to see if that's a possibility.
So I think that idea of the alternates is a really good one, in that then you guarantee you always have somebody at those meetings, because if someone for some reason can't be there, that means decisions are being made, things are moving forward, and your municipality just got left out of it. So I would, the same as we have alternates on some of our outside committees, I think that's an important one to have. So yes, if you could bring that one up and find out, I think that makes a good deal of sense to have. Any other questions or comments about this? Barry, go ahead.
Insurance. Since the new act is coming into place, it's the board's responsibility for the liability insurance, I believe. And have you looked at that area yet or not?
I can't say that I have delved into insurance as respect to the board as of yet. Niall?
Yeah, but
So to you, Madam Chair, that's a good catch. And again, a question I might take back to the province to see if there's any leadership on that, because the board actually should have its own insurance, because as with all good boards, when the board meets, the board is meeting on the principles of the best interests of the community it's serving, which are not necessarily aligned with the best interests of the member municipalities that the board members are participating on behalf of. Whilst most of the time those two things will convene, and indeed many organisations will have insurance which extends to their members. So Mayor Carlton has insurance from the Township of Georgian Bluffs, which extends to her role on the board of various different things. This board is an independent body that should perhaps look to having its own insurance, particularly if it is going to be meeting in locations which are not necessarily municipal locations. So that's a good catch, one worth looking into.
I understand in the new act that you have to provide insurance, liability insurance from the new board, because municipalities do not cover it in.
Yeah, so I think that's the point. Is does it need its own policy, or will it be covered under one or more of the policies of its founding members? And I think is a good question, needs to be asked.
Any other comments? Peter, go ahead.
I think, didn't the OAPSB have, when they were doing their most recent presentations on this whole CSPA, there were some checklists and insurance was mentioned. So there'd be some other things as well to fall back on in that group that would help us establish the new structure. Thanks.
Okay, any further questions on this, or are we receiving the presentation? I forget where I was at. We've got a motion on the floor, don't we? And so the recommendation, I'll just read again, was that the Township of Georgian Bluffs Police Services Board receive report COR 2024-003 for information. So if there's no further questions or comments or discussion, I would call the vote on that. All in favor? That is carried. So moving on, we have no unfinished business. For new business would just be about the comments about speeding on Elm Street Concession 21. I'll turn it over to Niall.
So through you, Madam Chair, thank you for raising that one. Yes, we'd heard the same. I think it's always the case when a road's been closed and had lower traffic volumes, and then traffic comes back. The perception of speed is certainly higher. further, when a road is closed and it's in less than pristine condition, and then that road is opened in pristine condition, the tendency to move a little quicker on that road than perhaps you have done in the past is there. And so we will put the speed trailer out as soon as it comes back out onto our sections, just to check what the speed is like on that area, and keep an eye on it. So I'm sure our colleagues will as well.
Okay, thank you. And I don't think we actually have anything else then. Date of next regular meeting will be March 5th, 2024 at 1 p.m. So if there's no further business, I will call for adjournment of this meeting. Could I have a mover and a seconder? Peter, Barry, all in favor? Carried. Thank you.